Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Securing a Remote Workforce, How to Get Started. My name is Tyne Dark, and I'm LogRhythm's Marketing Communications Manager. I'll be turning it over to your speakers today, James, Brian, and Andrew, in just a few moments. But before that, I'm going to hit on some of the standard housekeeping items. So first, everyone is in listen-only mode for audio quality. But with that said, today's event is really meant to be a conversation to help address the challenges that a lot of you are probably dealing with right now. So while our panelists have some questions they're already planning to discuss, if you have questions that you want answered, please send them through the chat feature at any point. We'll be keeping an eye on questions as they come in so that we can answer those related to the current discussion, but we'll leave time at the end for further Q&A as well. And one more audio note. We got a report earlier today that there were some audio issues with the platform. We're hoping those have since been resolved, but if they do arise, we'll make sure to either follow up with a clear version of the recording, a transcript, or something else to make sure you get all the information you're looking for today. And lastly, please take a look at the attachment section of this webinar. We've pulled together a number of resources that we think could be helpful for people who are dealing with the transition to a remote workforce and changes in security as a result of COVID-19. We have a few blog posts from both us and others, links to Slack channels that have been created specifically for cybersecurity practitioners to share tips during this time, and a few pre-made items for LogRhythm customers like dashboards to help you keep track of relevant threats. And with that, I'll turn it over to James to introduce himself and his fellow panelists and get the discussion going.
Sounds great. Thanks, Tyne. Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for joining us. I'm James Carter. I'm the Chief Security Officer for LogRhythm, and I also run a part of our R&D group called LogRhythm Labs. And with us, we've got Brian Emond, one of our best sales engineering directors, and Andrew Hollister, who also runs our global labs team and acts as a security advisor for the Office of the CISO in the LogRhythm corporate world. So today we're going to cover quite a bit about insights and trends that we're seeing, tips and tricks and best practices, provide you some resources, and other things around protecting our companies during times like this and best securing our remote workforce. We'll run this as a Q&A for both the panel members, and we'll try to be as interactive as possible with the audience as regards to any questions that you might have. There may be points where we'll pass on certain questions from our slides just based on the fact that we probably have answered that previously, and also in case we have time constraints, I want to get through a lot of the content. And please leverage the resources that Tyne had added in the attachments and links. There's a couple really cool Slack channels that one of them is an invite-only Slack channel, and the other is there's an attached link that you can actually go, be a part of that channel. They have, missed threat intelligence services and things that they're sharing out. So really cool stuff that I think that will help out quite a bit. So before we jump in, I'll set the stage. Regardless of the industry or business or even the current state of your business continuity and disaster recovery programs, we haven't really had to deal with anything like this before. The majority of us have never tested our BCDR plans to this level, including LogRhythm Corporate. For the technology industry and some others, the ability to work from home or remote, not going to an office, is often the norm. So I feel like we're a little better prepared than some other industries where it might be the exact opposite, and those companies dealing with this type of workforce for the very first time. So everybody usually has the typical questions you would ask when thinking about this. Will my infrastructure support the remote workforce? Is it capable of being operated in that way? If not, then what do I need to put in? How do I sustain the productivity of my workforce? Are my security controls and infrastructure built for this, or am I taking on additional risk? Do I even have security visibility anymore? And how do I handle operational logistics that require folks in the office? Or alternative measures when using third parties that are no longer in the office, so things like components of your supply chain. And what does BYOD mean? Do you allow home computers? And how do I keep my employees safe, most importantly? Attackers, as many of us know, love leveraging crisis, emergencies, and the latest global news and events to compromise us. Nothing new. They masquerade as legitimate organizations with legitimate websites, legitimate information that we all know. We've seen them quickly adjusting their tactics to prey on those of us with interest in information related to the current pandemic and honing their attack plans for that. So in addition, while security is never something to take lightly during any situation, especially not now, we know that businesses are making decisions with availability and operational production and the running of the business ahead of security. Oftentimes, there are concessions made that increase the security risk based on that. In such cases, companies are even more reliant on monitoring, detection, and response as a compensating control. That was a long-winded way of setting the stage, but we'll jump in, and what I'll do is I'll turn it over to our panel member. I'll read the question, I'll turn it over to one of our panel members, and we'll take turns responding and then forwarding on through that. So first question is, what are some key first steps organizations should take when they're transitioning their company to a more remote workforce? And maybe I'll turn this one over to Brian first.
Yeah, thanks, James. Happy to be here. I think this is an interesting time for our field, right? So specifically to this one, for first steps, organizations should really consider, I've had a couple of observations having access to our fields, our customers and our prospects. And really what I would say here is taking the time to sit down and make sure that your plan is in place and that you're prepared to even make kind of an adjustment to working from home or telework, right? Not taking that couple of minutes to do so could definitely lead you to, risk in stressing systems that were never designed to be used that way, right, from maybe a volume utilization perspective. Or definitely you move too quickly, you're going to leave yourself open to overlooking some security controls along the way. So specifically, I would say, be very vigilant about your visibility into your activity, your systems, and your network. The normal is likely changed, or has changed, or will change as you shift to more remote work. So expect that and be ready for it. Acknowledge it. From a leadership perspective, obviously your policies got to be in place. Your rules of engagement for how people are to conduct themselves now that they work from home is going to be critical. On top of maybe some of the the more common approaches to remote work, use your VPNs, secure your end systems with a good EDR solution. Verify integrity with two-factor authentication. Things along those lines.
Perfect. Andrew?
Yeah, no, thanks, Brian. And I from, and as James mentioned, an organisation like ourselves, we're quite used to remote working. We've got many of our users dotted around the world and working from remote offices already. And maybe it's not such a big lift to shift to moving the whole organisation to a remote working footing. But perhaps if I'm a heavily on-premise organisation, I don't typically have workers out on the road, then it's quite a different lift. And then I need to start considering things around perhaps some technology solutions that I don't have today. Things like VPNs, perhaps adopting some cloud services for certain types of activities. And that list's going to be a bit bigger if I'm a heavily on-prem organisation to start with. Other than that, as Brian alluded to, considering the resources, is my VPN actually up to supporting the 2,000 or 3,000 users perhaps who are now working from home, where it was supporting 200 or 300 before? Has my organisation got the bandwidth and the scale across all of those resources to be able to support all that kind of new activity that's coming in, perhaps from what's been a single point of ingress previously?
And I think this is James. I'll add in the aspect of, I think what's already been said is great around the technology, capacity planning, looking at the different technology options. We know for a fact there have been cases where certain collaboration technologies have, had bandwidth issues themselves, and so where people are, their customers are having problems leveraging that technology. But I think from a first steps and looking at it from an organizational perspective, is, hopefully this isn't the first time you're running your business continuity disaster recovery plan. I would say once you have some of these things in place, one of the important things is taking a look at the workflow of your business and being able to understand, like, how does my business operate? What do these particular groups of folks, interact with? And making sure that you've got coverage across that, whether remote or on-premise. And then I think you run a test of sample population. You have a readiness plan when things break, because things will eventually break. And then constant communication to the business, and even including some out-of-band backup options for communication. And then and beyond that, just constant awareness. So I'll go to question 2, which is, what trends are you seeing in attacker tactics as more companies are making the adjustment to remote work? And maybe I'll do the reverse order and go to Andrew first.
Yeah, so I think one of the interesting things I've observed so far is we're not really seeing anything terrifically novel in the trends. There's certainly a lot more scale, and what we're seeing is attackers kind of repurposing existing campaigns, repurposing existing attack vectors with new crisis-related content. There's really 2 main sides to that, I guess, and the one side of it is more user-focused. We've got all these users who've gone home, they're working from home, they've perhaps got concerns about their health, about their family, about their working environment, and so on. They're constantly looking for information, and of course their organizations are communicating with them about things that are related to the current crisis. Every other supplier is probably communicating with them as well. So it's creating a great space for attackers to kind of sneak in below all the noise and leverage the kind of typical phishing and watering hole type attacks. I think on the other side, then we're seeing an uptick in attacks against remote technology itself, i.e. things like VPNs, remote support sites, spoofing of SaaS-type websites and things like that. So certainly the overall that I'm seeing in any case is really leveraging existing attack vectors and upping the scale of those. Brian, what are you seeing?
Yeah, I completely agree, Andrew. Most of our customers, what I'm seeing is kind of a focus on the basics, right? Make sure your house is in order. Obviously, as James and Andrew alluded to, phishing thrives in these scenarios. So make sure that you have systems in place, procedures in place, educate your teams to understand and be vigilant about phishing attacks. I think ransomware and denial of service, we might be vulnerable. I know we are vulnerable if the majority of the organization is out in the field now versus kind of protected within the corporate walls. If ransomware, if we're compromised, it could threaten to bring us down, which has a terrible impact, right? More so than if only 100 of our users were remote like before. Then a couple of real-world examples I would add. Data exfiltration. Obviously, you got a lot of proprietary information that you're holding on to, and depending on the industry, we've seen reports of the World Health Organization being targeted specifically to get access to their data. Right? They're housing up-to-date information on like virus data, testing, cures, vaccines. So if you have any type, it doesn't have to be related specifically to COVID, if you have any type of information like that that's proprietary or valuable, what is that worth to a malicious user? Maybe last example I would hit on is we saw the Department of Health get hit, and really that looked like just a disruption campaign, right? The idea there was just to maybe undermine the U.S.'s ability to respond as efficiently as possible to the virus. And so a lot of different ways to come at us.
Perfect. Some of the things that weren't mentioned yet, I think that are also important is that the attacker knows that our visibility and our security and our ability to protect everything could be limited or even non-existent in some cases. So, they know that now is the time to strike when our shields are a bit down. But even if you think about it from a physical security perspective, I have operational oversight over our physical security operation as well. And attackers know that a lot of us are not occupying our buildings. Even though we left a lot of valuables within that building, we're not occupying them. And so I think, they know that that's a risk. I saw a report just today about the explosion of RDP being opened up to the internet. And people are making compensations like that or turning on split tunneling on their VPN just to save on corporate bandwidth, allowing home systems in. So the attacker knows that we're doing all these things to maintain kind of operational effectiveness. And oftentimes security is at the wayside. And, even things like collaboration technology, we had mentioned that, there have been a few providers that had some challenges there. And I think people, in an effort to do their job, they're using alternative means. So whether they're opening up Google Drive or Dropbox or anything like that, they are, the attacker knows how we operate and what those challenges could be and how we're going to compensate for them and what we're doing about that. So number 3 is, what are some common challenges you've seen with securing remote workforces? This may be a long one. We'll start with Brian. We'll try to keep our responses a little shorter so we can get through some of these questions, but I'll turn it over to Brian first.
Yeah, sure. I think from the field's perspective, really it's the accuracy or the existence of our business continuity plans in general. So I think for the most part, most of our customers, prospects know that it's valuable, it's important, but obviously, you got to put those things through the ringer to make sure that they're vetted and you're prepared. And likely, you may not have had this entire workforce going telework written in. So I think that leaves a pretty big gap. That's a challenge. Obviously, some of the challenges that arise from that is you're having to scramble after the fact. So what policies should be in place? What hardware do I need to scale out, or resources? What licensing do I need to accommodate that? And then from an analytics perspective, just keeping your eye on what's changed. How do my people operate day to day now that they're away from their cubicle? Is it typical? You got to understand what is normal and how the norm has adjusted, which is a challenge. And then I think maybe one of the biggest things that kind of spreads across all of this is once you identify what it is that needs to be done, now we need likely some dollars to fund this. We need some budget, to help us get it done and get it done the right way. So acquiring the budget is not an easy task either. Andrew?
Yeah, no, I think all of the above, and as you say, the norm has changed, and when an endpoint is sat on a desk within the corporate environment, the endpoint is present there, and it's just simply easier to secure and control. The traffic is present on the environment. All the kind of supporting controls around this as corporate-grade firewalls and proxies and so on and so forth. And a lot of this either disappears completely or is just non-existent in a home environment. And kind of just to follow down that route a bit, if your remote workforce, you suddenly have to send them home, you haven't been able to procure laptops and dial-up and all the other kind of things that you need. Perhaps they're accessing the corporate environment from a home computer, some kind of other bring-your-own device. That's you can't deploy security on that endpoint. You don't control it. And then we're really looking at finding other compensating controls around securing that endpoint, perhaps more monitoring on the VPN, more monitoring of your SaaS environments.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's related to this is we had a question from the audience about securing the internet traffic when the staff works at home. They're asking if commercial or enterprise VPN is a possible solution and any other recommendations. And yes, I think that the enterprise VPN is a good solution, but there are bandwidth considerations that you have to consider. If you force everything through your VPN, you better have a decent amount of pipe coming out of your corporate facilities to be able to handle that traffic. So there are some gotchas there, but forcing enterprise VPN is a good way to kind of regain that that network visibility of the internet traffic. Other things too is there are endpoint agents and EDR products that can actually do network monitoring on the host level, so they can deploy an agent, they can do some kind of network analysis, network detection and response on the host level itself, looking at what where that host is communicating, what sites they're visiting, etc. And I think lastly, some companies have deployed CASB type solutions where they proxy all the traffic through a location, where it can be monitored or controlled. All those different aspects will give you, give you back access into that internet traffic. So moving on, question 4, is there a degradation of visibility with a remote workforce? If so, how do we regain that visibility? And so I'll turn it over to, we'll keep alternating. I'll turn it over to Andrew.
Yeah, no, absolutely. There does tend to be a degradation of visibility with suddenly moving all our endpoints out from the corporate environment, as we've just discussed, really. And I think in terms of regaining that visibility, there's probably a number of different things that we can do. Probably the easy way, and James, you just alluded to this now, typically your endpoint AV or EDR is a good vector of visibility back out into those devices that have gone home, and it, ensuring that the endpoint can communicate with the central configuration manager when they're remote is an obvious one here. But also doing things like collecting logs from your VPN infrastructure, collecting logs and data from things like Office 365, from Salesforce, i.e. your SaaS applications, and really make sure that you're pulling in all those kinds of things. And I guess in addition to that, also where you're doing your authentication is a really good visibility vector into what your users are doing. So things like AD, single sign-on, two-factor authentication, those are all things, if we tap into, we can get some of that visibility back into what's really going on with our users and data.
Yeah, very good, Andrew. I think for this one, it's very likely that there are some of us out there that we're really well prepared for this. We're ahead of the game. Maybe our industry allowed us to be more remote. So in those cases, maybe not so much. But for the vast majority, especially if you've logged in and you're listening to this webinar, some additions or adjustments had to kind of be made on the fly to accommodate this. And obviously that leans towards the potential for degradation. In terms of regaining, I think it's probably a focus on understanding the shift, right? What is, we've talked about it a couple times, what is the new norm? What's the new footprint? And then after you're able to identify what it is, I think it's a huge piece is having some executive backing, some leadership buy-in to aggressively go get that, close that gap, because obviously being blind doesn't really help anybody. Another thing that might be able to help is I've mentioned before, those workers obviously are out remote in the field now. What does their role look like? What is their day-to-day? If you're able to kind of define what is typical for them, and then apply that to the new footprint, that alone, that exercise could bubble up some visibility gaps.
Yeah, I think some other things too to consider. Thanks, Andrew and Brian. Is I'm a big zero trust guy. We've been talking about it for years, and obviously with that type of environment, we're rolling that out in our corporate offices as well, where there really is you're used to this remote workforce and having visibility into that. And so I think if you're heading down that path, you may already have a lot of things in place that you can leverage to do that. Otherwise, you will degrade some visibility. And I think the other part that hasn't been mentioned that's worth mentioning is that even this could even occur with various security products. So things that rely on behaviors and behavior-based analytics. If you think about that, oftentimes those products take about 30 days or more to baseline. And so when your entire workforce changes from being on-prem to being off-site, you have to basically re-baseline your entire platform. And I think that's the reason why you still need some of the other technology capabilities, whether it's SIEM and EDR and a few other things like that, to be able to compensate for that, because there are some gaps there that if those are your primary methods of monitoring, detection, and response, where you may have a situation where everything becomes an anomaly. So those are also things to consider as a part of a degradation of visibility for the remote workforce. Next question is, what type of logs or log collection methods should security teams focus on? Any best practices? I think it's only appropriate that if LogRhythm is doing this webinar, we talk about log collection. So I'll hand it over to Brian.
Let's do it. Yeah, we've had this conversation before. So I think a great goal that many people come to the table with is just full visibility, 100%, a collection across the board, which is a good goal to have, as long as if we're focused on different types of log source types, we can ask compelling questions of that data in one way, shape, or form, security, operationally. But in times like these, especially, and even in your standard day-to-day for log collection, we usually have to prioritize the list, right? Some log sources carry more weight than others and provide more visibility. So obviously might be pretty basic, but lean towards any critical infrastructure that maybe you don't have insight to, assets, or know where your critical or your proprietary data is. Those investments that you have in your environment, the other security technologies that are in play, make sure we have good visibility into that. And then anything that really focuses on kind of the tactics and techniques that we've discussed so far. So we've talked about, phishing, ransomware, denial of service. Make sure that you have the logs associated with those that gives us that level of visibility. I think another piece that typically plays into, what types of logs and in what order, one easy way to look at it is, the level of effort for onboarding. So, it doesn't necessarily have to be your most critical log source in your environment. If you're able to knock it out and onboard it in 5 minutes or less, then that's value add and visibility that you quickly brought to the table. So one other thing that I'd mention is just monitoring those laptops that are now out in the field, right? What I think Andrew hit on this a little bit before. There are some cases where they're not connected to VPN. They just won't be, but they still have that local activity data that is worth value. So we had that when they were in their cubicle, connected to the headquarters PC. Think of ways, different methodologies to go after this, but think of ways to still have, close to relative real-time access to, those remote systems, so that we gain that visibility as well. So think about secured channels to get that log data back to you at corporate, whatever solution you're using, possibly a LogRhythm. And then think about how that data gets to us, even outside of a VPN. So maybe a NATed internet-facing IP address that gets us back to our collection, our collection host. So a few things to think about there.
Yeah, and Brian, I think that's pretty comprehensive what you've outlined there. As you say, to 100% collection of everything is a great goal to have. Perhaps in this time of emergency and quickly seeing a lot of workers going remote, it's not necessarily realistic. And kind of alluding to the previous question, really, we really start with authentication. AD, single sign-on, two-factor, etc. James?
Yeah, definitely. I wanted to sort of, kind of following you guys on answering this question, I want to get a few questions from the audience here. One of them was around DBI and using DBI in lieu of split tunnel VPNs. Yes, I think that's actually a good thing, and what a lot of companies I know are doing is they're spinning up Citrix farms very quickly in order to leverage things like DBI type solutions instead of doing VPNs and things like that. So that is a valid method of that. And then another question is around distributed secure access, Zscaler, Palo Alto Prisma. At the end of the day, yeah, I mean, you're sort of load balancing across multiple, access points. And so, anytime you're doing that, obviously, it is a fine option to, especially when you really think about it from a capacity and the ability to sustain that remote workforce perspective. So another good point to make. So moving on, and we'll go to question 6 here. What types of changes in network activity can be expected after shifting to more remote activities? Does this vary by industry? Andrew?
Yeah, I think it's highly dependent on the type of organization and the degree of cloud adoption that the organization has had previously, and we've been into this a little bit already. There is no one-size-fits-all for any of these questions. It's a lot to do with the type of organization you are and how you've built out your IT infrastructure up until now. And just to take one example, an on-prem, heavily on-prem based organization, you typically have seen a lot of traffic outbound via the proxy. You may now be seeing most traffic coming inbound via VPN. And to the point that was just asked around split tunnels and so on, perhaps a split tunnel VPN means you don't see any of the traffic going to, a Dropbox, a Google Drive, and so on and so forth. So you won't see those types of traffic, and ultimately those could go completely invisible to us. Brian, I think you had some comments on some industry specifics as well, didn't you?
Yeah. So I would say absolutely it's going to vary by industry, and each industry is impacted in a different way because of this shift, right? So a couple examples, we could all use our movies or our sports right now, right? But or entertainment industry shut down, which has led to maybe streaming media taking a big bump. Similar story on retail. The brick and mortars they don't have a choice. They have to kind of close doors and shift to strategies to bolster their internet sales. Education-wise, schools are shutting down, but my sister-in-law is a teacher. She's preparing online learning recordings for her second graders. So even K through 12 is shifting to virtual. Healthcare volumes just kind of through the roof, as you'd expect. Government in general kind of spans all industries, depending on where you're focused on. But they certainly have mission critical pockets where just kind of cannot miss a beat, right? So it absolutely varies by industry, but even within the industries, I think you see kind of a shuffle. One thing I thought was interesting here in terms of activity and our focus as security practitioners, all of those organizations, all of our organizations, have relatively the same proprietary data, classified information, general security needs that we had before all of this went down, before COVID-19. Now we're just trying to adjust as efficiently as possible to the pressures of our IT footprint growing or moving and adapting, right? James?
Yeah, perfect. I think something else that sort of goes along with industry is critical infrastructure, as you mentioned. It's not like we're moving the power grid or the dam anytime soon. And so those networks are traditionally air-gapped, but since they are critical infrastructure, those workers are still going in. So your visibility may not change in some of that environment, but other ones too, in addition to just, the network activity changing, but, also the user behaviors are going to be shifting as well. The methods where how they access the network, their locations are all going to be different now. So really being able to get visibility into all that's important. And then you also may want visibility into things like, hey, are you guys making, as a company or as a business, making decisions with your employees to be able, whether that be furloughing employees, whether that be, reducing compensation, whether that be, laying people off in general. All that stuff is happening right now, especially in some of the, industry verticals that Brian mentioned. And so, you may want to know if these types of actions and what the ramifications are and how those employees are coming, maybe attempting to come back into the environment in some capacity. So being able to monitor those users is pretty critical as well. All right, number 7, once log collection is in place, what are some priority use cases to deploy? And so I'll turn over to Brian first.
Yeah, one of the ones I really thought was interesting, James, you hit on a little bit, was the idea of, obviously user baselining has its place in our day-to-day now as as security professionals, but very few examples of kind of overnight the switch gets flipped and everyone behaves differently. That's an interesting wrinkle, right? What happens to our baselines when everyone's normal changes for the most part. So it really just kind of highlighted to me that you should take the time and make sure that the basics are in order, right? Your visibility is where it needs to be, where you're comfortable, you don't have those blind spots, and that your correlation and your notification is in place too for those known threats, especially now. Another thing we hit on was really just being outspoken and vigilant about phishing attacks. So it's a pretty common one, but it's common because it works. So I wouldn't take it lightly. Your employees, your staff are rightfully interested in updates or updates to corporate policy from perceived CEO, right? So easy rabbit hole to jump down. Be cautious. Make sure they're educated. And do your best to avoid those. Andrew?
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think there's probably a few interesting use cases that are kind of directly related to the change of location of your workforce. I think, looking at VPN, for example, if all my workers go home, they're probably in a reasonably confined geo. And I might want to start monitoring, for example, where is my VPN being connected to, which geos are connecting in there, to see if there's bad actors really trying to hide in the noise of all the new VPN access, but coming from a geo where I know I don't have any staff, for example. I think it'll also be very important to carefully monitor cloud services for any changes. It's easy to grant too much permission to resources on the cloud already, even in normal times, and under the pressure of all this change, could be quite easy to mess up and expose data to the open internet when you intended to actually just publish it to your internal organization who have gone home. And just one thing I kind of read anecdotally, there seems to be interest in brute forcing against the VPNs that have suddenly popped up all over the place, and just a bit of advice not to dump the domain users group in AD straight into the VPN authorization group. You don't want to give bad actors the opportunity to force brute force every AD account in the network. So it's just taking those extra bit of time to think about those steps.
Yeah, those are all good points. I think the couple ones I didn't hear mentioned that I know that we've written a blog on the LogRhythm Lab side, which is around, a use case around young domains or known indicators of compromising domains associated with, COVID-19 or anything of the like that people may be leveraging. And so I know there are some organizations like RiskIQ and Domain Tools and a few of these that are giving out free lists of feeds of known indicators domain indicators of compromise, but also looking at young domains because people are buying up all these domains, coronavirus, COVID, remote employee, you name it, they're buying it up as a way to try to lure you as well. The other one, too, is a couple of things around device monitoring and access, whether it's a trusted device that you own, a BYOD that you've previously approved, or home PCs, and how you actually deal with those specific scenarios. Those all should be use cases that you're actually looking at. And then collaboration technology, one of the interesting things we want to look at is, who's using all the various collaboration platforms, and are there capacity constraints that you can see around that? It's more of an operational monitoring component, but something that you might be interested in looking at as well. And so with that, I'll answer, there's a question in the audience associated with if you have the option to ingest endpoint remote laptop logs versus a dev environment logs, which do you feel is more important? I think that really depends on the business. For us as a software development company, I'll be honest, like it's not so much if someone has our code, it's a matter of if someone is able to inject bad things into our code that impact our customers. And so I want to know more about the endpoint laptop logs and what my employee base is doing and how my developers are actually accessing that environment. But I don't think it's an either or. I think if you have to prioritize it, it's going to be a business decision. And I know for us, we would put endpoint first and then dev second. But that is a business decision. And when it's dev environment, I'm assuming we're thinking development and not production. So that's another aspect of it as well. So we'll go to the question 8. Once you have visibility, I believe this has actually been answered already quite a few times. So and for the sake of time, I'll pass this one. We'll go to question 9. What types of impacts or trends have you seen as a result from the rush to support remote work due to COVID? We'll go to Andrew first on this one.
Yeah, so I think as we mentioned earlier in the webinar, you may have had to make some concessions to security in order to keep the business afloat and in order to move the workforce home. And I read a report earlier today about a huge percentage increase. I think it was something like 40% increase in the number of RDP endpoints exposed to the internet in the last 2 or 3 weeks. And obviously businesses have felt they've needed to do that in order to continue with business as usual as far as it's possible. But obviously it's very important to see that those risks are really evaluated and that you try to mitigate any concessions that you do make to security accordingly. I think there's probably been a much higher probability to make mistakes in configuration, again, due to this rush to work from home. And we've talked, there's been a little bit of a theme here about VPNs. I wouldn't be at all surprised to start seeing denial of service on attempts on VPN. As James mentioned, if the whole workforce has gone home and we're all dependent on connecting back to that access point, that's going to become of interest to bad actors. Brian?
Yeah, I'd agree. I think some of these we've covered in other answers here, but I think for the most part, observations that I've had specifically for the LogRhythm field, customers and prospects, has really been centered around who has been able to make these adjustments, seamlessly, versus who was caught unprepared. And like I said earlier, they kind of it alludes to the effort that you really put into your business continuity plan. Not just in the development of it, but the frequent testing of it as well, right? What would it really take if something like this goes down and we're all teleworkers now? It does lead to I explained dollars being an issue. It's the right thing for the organization to do, but that doesn't mean it's free. So got to go find the money. Usually that's a challenge in and of itself. And the hard pill to swallow there is that the money is typically there. It just has to come from something else that you wanted, right? Now one of your other projects take a backseat. Another one that's relatively common we hit on too, and we've experienced it here at LogRhythm, we're the same. We have a reliance on these, these virtual meeting providers now. So we're all using these video conferencing technologies to get our day-to-day done. And when everybody in the world points their need at them at the same time, they'll take a performance hit as well. So a lot of customers having to manage their way through that also. It takes a hit to productivity in some cases.
All right, perfect. Thanks for that, gentlemen. We're not going to get to question 10 just because we're out of time, but I'll answer one last question from the audience, which is, actually, sorry, I think my question just moved, so maybe I won't. Oh, sorry. Is there any move for companies to team up and preemptively sinkhole COVID domains? They're already doing that. There are, I mentioned in the attachments and links, there's some associations with a few different groups. There are Slack channels around that where people are actually working together to sinkhole domains and providing that intel back. So that is actually already happening across multiple industries. And so, please feel free to join those groups and get access to some of that and work, feel free to work together with them. And I'm also on a few other private intel groups that are doing the same thing. So, yes, that's happening. With that time, I don't know if you have any last minute items before we close out. I know we're not going to get to the last question.
Yeah, so I just want to say thank you, everyone, for joining today. Like James said, we had an extra question planned, and we're just getting a couple of additional audience questions in now. So I think we'll go ahead and take those and put together some follow-up materials so we can follow up with the people who attended this and answer those final questions. But again, thank you for joining. We hope that you found today valuable. And if you're interested in digging more into the tactical side of establishing a remote workforce, we're doing another webinar. It's going to be a week from today on April 7th called Ask Me Anything, Tips from the Trenches to Implement a Remote Team. You can find the link to register in the attachment section on this webinar. And this is going to focus specifically on what LogRhythm did to rapidly make the transition to a remote team. Our CIO, Rex Young, and Strategic Integrations Engineer, Zach Rowland, will be joining us to explain how they executed this, and they'll be answering whatever questions people have about their implementation process. And for other future LogRhythm events, please go to logrhythm.com and check out our events page. So thanks again for joining. Stay healthy, stay safe, and have a great rest of your day.